Okay, so in this lesson, we are going to talk about conditional statements. Basically, I want you to think about it, conditional statements as if then statements. They don't always have to say if and then, but like something and then something else. Something leads to something, right? So for this first one, if you're Mr. Lopez, you're cool, right? Now, the great thing about conditional statements is that when you use them, you kind of assume, let me write that again, them to be true. Like, they have to be true. Otherwise, they have to be true statements. You'll see what I mean. Otherwise, they're not useful. So if you're Mr. Lopez, then you are cool. If it's a mammal, then it's warm-blooded. If you work overtime, then you'll be paid time and a half. If 2 divides evenly into x, then x is an even number. Go ahead and pause the video and make your own, but remember, it has to be true. Okay? So let's go ahead and make one. So actually, I'll just take one of these, right? So this is called our conditional statement. Representation, P, then Q. So remember, this is true. If Mr. Lopez, if you are, then you are cool. Now, while these aren't always, this one's true, right? If this isn't true, then the rest really don't fall into place. So we're assuming this is true. That doesn't mean it's true, but we have to assume it's true in this case. We have this thing called the converse, and that reverses the direction. So we have if Lopez, then cool, right? So if cool, then you must be Mr. Lopez. The question is that true? If you're cool, then do you have to be me? No. Let's talk about something called the inverse. The notation is that is not P, means not Q. So if not Mr. L, then not cool. So if you're not Mr. Lopez, then you are not cool. That's not necessarily true. If you're not Mr. Lopez, you can be cool. It doesn't say Mr. Lopez is the only cool person alive. So that one's false. Lastly, we have something called the contrapositive. Contrapositive. It's an S and then an I. I think I might write that. That would be not Q, not P. So let's look at this. So P, Q, not Q. So if you're not cool, then not Mr. Lopez. Think about it. If we start with our original statement, which is if you're Mr. Lopez, then you're cool. If that's true, then does that mean if you're not cool, then you can't be Mr. Lopez? That's exactly what it means. Because if I'm cool and I'm not cool, well, if I'm cool because of Mr. Lopez, well, if Mr. Lopez is cool, then that means if you're not cool, you can't be Mr. Lopez. So these are, assuming that this is true, these are always going to be true. Do the second part of the notes. All right, so let's do another example. If you live in Brooklyn, then you live in New York City. So this is our conditional statement. Which is P, then Q. So if Brooklyn, then New York City. If you don't know that, that's the name of a place in New York City. We're going to assume it's true. We're going to assume there's no other Brooklyns. Remember that. Because we're assuming that this is true. Now, there probably are some other places named Brooklyn, but for our sake, we're assuming this is true. So let's do the converse, which is Q and then P. So if live in NYC, New York City, then live in Brooklyn. If you live in New York, do you have to live in that neighborhood? No. Let's talk about the inverse, which is not P, not Q. So if you don't live in Brooklyn, I'm going to put, so I can take a little bit of space. If you don't live in Brooklyn, then you don't live in New York City. So if you do not live in Brooklyn, then you do not live in New York. Remember, we're assuming. Oh, let's back up. So if you don't live in Brooklyn, then you don't live in New York. Think about it. If you don't live in Brooklyn, does that mean you don't live in New York? There are other parts of New York, like city, Manhattan, the Bronx, like different places. So if you don't live in Brooklyn, then you don't live in New York. That is not true. You can live in New York. And the contrapositive. So not Q, then not P. So not, if you don't live in New York City, then you don't live in Brooklyn. Remember, we're assuming that if you live in Brooklyn, you're in New York. So Brooklyn's only in New York. So if you don't live in New York, can you live in Brooklyn? No, you can't. So if you don't live in New York, then you don't live in Brooklyn. That is a true statement. You can't live in Brooklyn in this scenario because Brooklyn is in New York. And just to give you a heads up on some of the work, you're going to be given different parts. So if you attend Daggett Middle School, then your mascot is a bulldog. So, I'm not always going to put the conditional statement here or here or here. It's just going to be like moved around. And sometimes I'm going to give you inverse, and they're going to be moved around. It's not always going to look the same. So this is my conditional. It's pretty simple. There's no knots or anything like that. And that's P and then Q. I take it you understand this. You can technically put them in any order. I just even if you do, I kind of like putting converse next. It doesn't have to go after, but I like writing it next. And then if I wanted to put contrapositive here, I could do that and everything. As long as you go through it, you'll start to see some definite, you'll have your own system. Thank you.